In our last session we spoke about the difference between the conception of liberty as a value or as an a priori, a first principle. But what actually is an a priori? In your book Principles of Liberty you write, Apriorism was defined here in the sense of Aristotelian apriorism as shared by the Austrian school in Rothbard, 1957 and Smith, 1996. This sounds as if you tried to explain the a priori by its own term.
Well, not really. It was not my intention to define apriorism, but rather to narrow it down. Apriorism is not such a straightforward concept as could be thought. There are many different approaches and controversies. I tried to limit those controversies to the Austrian school. And since there are even within the Austrian school many different nuances, I strictly limited it to the branch of those following the Aristotelian tradition.
I see. Could you explain how these different schools are distinct from each other?
Sure. Firstly, let's have a look at the term apriorism and what it means. There are basically two different ways of understanding apriorism. On the one hand, it can be understood as the way in which we can come to knowledge, without the need of observation or experience. When relating to this, we often speak of intuition, beliefs, or assumptions. On the other hand, a statement itself can be defined as a priori, thus the result of reasoning. These are called implications or self-evident principles. They are strictly pre-logical as a condition for logical thinking. Therefore, the Oxford Dictionary says that apriorism precedes theoretical deduction, and the Merriam-Webster Dictionary emphasizes further that a priori knowledge is self-evident. I miss in these definitions a mention which would explain the role of certainty in a priori knowledge, but I will speak about this later.
Thus, a priori is something that is held for true, but we do not know if it is true.
Not really. It's not that simple. I think the best way to understand what an a priori is to learn how different views on apriorism diverge. Barry Smith, in my understanding, has offered one of the best approaches to the problem. Back in 1996, Barry Smith wrote a short article titled "In Defense of Extreme Fallibilistic Apriorism." At the end of his article, he added a diagram in which different theories on a priori knowledge were discerned along 9 stochastic questions, following 9 paradigmatic criteria. First, Apriority as scientific source. Second, Analyticity of scientific propositions. Third, the necessity of truth. Fourth, arbitrary against logical, rule-based structure of science. Fifth, contextual plausibility or contingency. Sixth, the syntheticity against the analyticity of scientific knowledge. Seventh, epistemological versus ontological a priori. Eighth, the certainty of ontological a priori. And ninth, this is an amendment made by myself, liberty as a priori principle.
Could you explain these steps a little bit more?
Of course. I will go through these steps with you and we will see where I position my own philosophy and why.
Great.
Smith's first question concerned the source of knowledge in general. The question is if reality rests on something that was not empirical. Therefore, Smith asked, Do the empirical theories, with the help of which we seek to approximate a good or true picture of reality, rest on any non-empirical presuppositions? This could be answered either as yes or no. Those who believe that reality is limited to empirical experiences, or at least that what could be known about reality is based on empirics, are denominated as extreme empiricists. The opposite position is the one of rationalism, to which my philosophy belongs. I will not enter into debates if extreme empiricism makes sense. The time here would not be sufficient to answer such a complex question. In a second step, Smith deals with the analyticity of scientific propositions. The question is, are there propositions which express these pre-empirical assumptions in every case analysis, or are they tautological or lacking in content? These scientists, known as logical positivists, believe that even though such a priori assumptions exist, they could not be tested against reality. So they have to be taken as is. Obviously, this is not my position. In fact, to link the a priori to reality was one of the challenges in my research, since liberty was assumed the a priori source of personhood, but persons were concrete, existing objects. Besides, the a priori was used as a framework for defining a person as such. Further, the problem was if such an a priori was always and automatically true, a position upheld by extreme Cartesians. I rather followed the approach in synthetic apriorism. I do not believe that, as somewhere stated, we have an infallible knowledge of all the synthetic pre-empirical propositions which are presupposed by the various sciences in the different phases of their development. Testing the truth is not only possible but necessary. This is probably the first point where I step out of Hoppian argumentation ethics, even though Hoppe's conception of the performative contradiction seems to be a kind of test for his a priori. True to John Locke's theory, Hoppe seems quite sure that such a test was only helpful in terms of explanation, but could not change anything about the true statement of his a priori. This was something he knew intuitively, and was therefore right. I do not agree with this. In my opinion, any a priori is always open to revision. In fact, my research was revising the general worldview of Western philosophy on which also Hoppe's theory rested. Intuitions can be wrong.
But is it really possible to test such an a priori? I mean, one thing is that they are open to revision, another is to prove them as right.
That's true. Indeed, some philosophers following synthetic apriorism did not believe that there were any logical structures or rules on which science rested. It was all completely arbitrary. We call this position epistemological anarchism. A famous scholar in this field is Feyerabend. Rationalist positions do not believe in the arbitrariness of a priori assumptions. Assumptions must be plausible in some way. They must make sense. Now, from this idea, another problem arose, namely, if plausibility was always a contextual affair. For example, if a priori assumptions were culturally bound or otherwise contingent. Hugh Lewis and other hermeneutic relativists insist in this opinion. On the other side, synthetic apriorism believes the a priori to be true under any condition. The sixth question was about syntheticity, or analyticity of scientific knowledge, and concludes with the definite distinction of the Austrian school from others as a position belonging to rationalism and to synthetic apriorism. This question asks if those who believe a priori to be intrinsically plausible, pre-empirical and synthetic propositions also believe that they were universal, or if they were given to specific individuals only. A major discussion within Austrian schools is the one between Austrian Kantians and Austrian Aristotelians. Even though Kant admired Aristotle, there was a central discrepancy between the two different approaches. Kant believed the a priori to be imposed by us upon the world. Aristotelians believed that they were pre-existent. But if they were not imposed, the question was where they came from and what could be known about them. Perhaps they were all illusions. Aquinas made such considerations. Others, for instance, Descartes, Saint Anselm and Plotinus, did not think so. Finally, we come to the key problem in Kantian philosophy, the transition gap. It was one of the few unsolved problems in his philosophy. According to Kant's own record, he couldn't find any way out that would link the structured and almost complete system of categories and syllogism and his transcendental criticism with reality. Apparently, a priori assumptions correlated with real-life phenomena. But how to explain this? Even simpler, closer to our personal experience, there are processes of knowing and there are changes in our being. Physical, psychological, noetic. But in which way does our thinking impact on our being? We all feel that it happens, but a systematic explanation could not be given in Kantian philosophy. I might be wrong, but I had the impression that even the most innovative approaches in Austrian philosophy did not fully address this problem. There were two ways in which the ontological turn had entered Austrian philosophy in the last 2 or 3 decades. One was Böttke, and others at the Mercator Institute, who were increasingly interested in empirical testing of principles in economy. A very different approach, and perhaps the most coherent one, was found in Hoppe's ethics. Yet both remained in a Vygotskian-style ontological turn, only linking knowledge to action. They assumed, and I agree, that there was an interdependence between knowing and acting. The original Heideggerian enterprise to connect knowledge with being was either rejected or neglected. I returned to this original problematics of the ontological turn through the reading of Mises' theory of action, praxeology. Mises assumed that praxeology was a priori for all actions in economics, and I wondered why only in economics. If we extended this assumption to all personal existence, we could end concluding that being a person was basically an acting being. Finally, this is how I came to Plotinus, his equivalence between acting in the sense of perpetual performance, not the concluded act, liberty and the first principle of personal becoming. Observe that I also modified the Kantian categories. Kant started with being as his first principle. We find the same in Heidegger and also in 20th century Aristotelian traditions, yet becoming was an alternative proposition, rather neglected. Now, It must be admitted that Smith's question is ambivalent. What did he mean with truth makers? And what does it mean that they are required? If we should understand it in the sense that liberty should only be considered as a first principle if it would be found in the word, probably Hoppe would object it. For Hoppe, the right to live does not exist because you can test it through argumentation. Even if you were not able to do so, it would still apply. In turn, liberty is not only a condition for personal existence. The idea of liberty itself depends on the fact that persons exist. In a world of mere objects, there would be no reason to imply, logically, such a concept as liberty. I feel that also Böttger goes rather in this direction, when he searches for empirical proof. But I'm not sure how far he would go.
This explains why personhood is such a central concept in your work. We will address this topic in our next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.